So with deconstructing the man cave, what we're actually talking about is what happens when men start taking over more responsibility for running the family household, leaving their wives to pursue careers on much more even footing than we have now. We can talk all we want about house husbands as sort of a cliche or a source of comedy for a television program, but what happens when this becomes a reality? That half the households are in fact run by the males, the husbands, and not the wives. And the particular issue I'm going to focus on now is one I think is going to be somewhat contentious, and that is because we have to keep a house clean. And the idea is that house husbands may not have exactly the same priorities and goals when it comes to keeping a household clean that housewives or female homemakers have traditionally had. And I want to start off by asking a pretty basic question here, and that's why you're getting this bizarre view of the inside of my house. And that is, how do you know when you have to clean something? I mean, it seems like a pretty simple, straightforward question, but how exactly do you determine that it's time to clean some part of the house? And it would be easy to say, well, you use your senses, so something can look dirty, right? So, for example, if we kind of focus in here on the floor, we can see that we have a lot of little items on the floor. Look to me like they might be tiny little leaves from the tree in the neighbor's house. And so, yeah, it does look like maybe it could be time to do a little bit of vacuuming or sweeping up here. The interesting thing is that having become visually aware of that dirt, I don't feel a particular need to sweep or vacuum at all. And that's, I suppose, going to be the point of this little segment, that house husbands may not have the same priorities when it comes to cleaning as housewives. What about when you can't see dirt, but another sense comes into play? How about smell, the sense of smell? Does that tell us when we have to clean something? I think we've all experienced that problem with the refrigerator. It looks sort of the same way it normally does, but something just smells wrong. And isn't it a joy to try to figure out what it is that needs to be cleaned out of the refrigerator by smelling every item and every section of the fridge until you come up with something so utterly disgusting that it causes you to gag. But nevertheless, it looked the same. Didn't see the dirt. It was smell that dominated sight as an indication that something had to be cleaned. What about the sense of touch? Again, if we go back to the floor, if you're walking across a hard floor and you step on something and you can feel the dirt or the grit under your feet, that may tell you it's time to sweep the floor, time to vacuum the floor. Then you have the sense of touch, probably not primary in terms of determining whether some part of the house needs to be cleaned, but certainly you can. A sense of hearing, so I can walk across a hard floor and hear something crunch, or conversely, I can be walking across a carpet and hear something go squish and say, okay, that sounds like something needs to be cleaned. So yeah, touch and sound can come into play, maybe not as primary, but certainly as senses that can be part of the cleaning process in terms of detecting dirt. So what about the sense of taste? Now that seems to be much more of a theoretical possibility than anything else. You could use a sense of taste, for example, for going back to the refrigerator and finding that disgusting item that needs to be thrown out. I don't think we would really want to go there trying to taste dirt in the household to determine whether or not something needed to be cleaned. But theoretically, all five senses can be involved in moving around the house and determining whether something needs to be cleaned. And this is where I think we're going to find that house husbands and housewives are going to approach things very differently, both in terms of what scents they use to determine whether something needs to be cleaned, and in terms of when they decide to clean it. Keep in mind there's something that we haven't spoken about yet when it comes to cleaning around the house. And so the other thing that we haven't really considered is sometimes we clean things around the house not because it looks dirty or smells dirty or sounds dirty or feels dirty, but simply because we haven't cleaned it in quite a while. I mean, I think something like bed sheets, for example, or vacuuming the carpet or floor. So, sometimes it's none of our sensory inputs are telling us that it's dirty, but we simply say, hey, it's been a while, I should probably do it. But in terms of how house husbands and housewives might approach the whole cleaning task or chore for around the house differently, we might consider two things, filth thresholds and filth tolerance levels. All right, now these are not the same thing, and there's an important distinction, right? A filth threshold is the point at which you detect dirt, the point at which you say, wow, that's dirty. I can see the dirt, I can smell the dirt. In some cases, I might be able to feel the dirt. So I know the dirt is there. Whereas the filth tolerance level is the maximum amount of filth that you can possibly tolerate before things start to be so filthy that it starts, turning you bat crazy. And you feel like, I've got to clean it. I can't stand the amount of dirt that's around me. And here is where I think both with respect to filth thresholds and filth tolerance levels, that males and females, or house husbands and housewives, are going to have really different views about whether something is dirty and whether something needs to be cleaned. So to give you an idea of filth thresholds and how that works, my wife will constantly go past my teenage son's room and say, clean this place, it's filthy. And he says, quite innocently, but I think honestly, what's wrong? I don't see any dirt. And she'll go over to a bookshelf and she'll run her finger across the bookshelf. And of course, there's a nice line of soot or dust on her finger. She says, this is what I mean. She sees that. To her, there's dust everywhere in that bedroom, visually. I think she can smell dust, to be honest. Whereas for him, he doesn't see it at all. It looks perfectly clean to him. Another example is with respect to, again, I mentioned vacuuming, and I mentioned the floor earlier on the way in, that I didn't feel any particular need to vacuum or sweep the floor, even though I could actually see dirt. So it's above my filth threshold. I can see the dirt, but it's below my maximum filth tolerance level. I can tolerate much more filth on the floor before I feel any need to sweep up or to vacuum anything. By the way, I don't think these are inherent differences. I don't think we need to get into any sociobiology or evolutionary psychology nonsense. This has to do with how males and females are socialized. And in that sense, I think over time, as men get more and more involved in domestic labor, these differences will slowly fade away. But for now, if a little 6-year-old boy comes home from playing outside covered head to toe in mud, that's not a good thing, right? But it's something that we say, that's what little boys do, right? But if a little girl who's 6 years old comes back in her pink dress, as long as we're in a gender stereotype here, why not go for all the works? If she comes back covered in mud head to toe, somehow that is still seen as less acceptable. And so from a very early age, I think boys and girls are socialized very differently about how to react to filth. So it's hardly a surprise that as grown-ups or as adults, married spouses, that they have different filth tolerance thresholds and different filth tolerance levels. It's a natural part of the socialization process. Nevertheless, I do think that in the short run, as husbands start taking over more and more responsibilities and more husbands say, yes, I will be in charge of keeping the house clean, that probably there are going to be some professional wives out there who are pushing their way up into the C-suite to take over as CEOs and CFOs, who frankly, in the short run, if you want those things, are going to have to get used to tolerating maybe a little bit more filth and a little bit more dirt in the household than they would personally like. But you know what? I've talked to many women like this who are the breadwinners, fantastically successful careers. And they've said, initially, when my husband started taking over more and more domestic responsibilities, I wasn't always happy with how he was doing things. And cleaning comes up a lot when I talk to these women. But you know what they say? They say in the long run, I decided that if I wanted to be CEO of a top company in my industry, it was worth, tolerating a little bit of filth. So I think these things can be negotiated, but I also think that they have to be anticipated and discussed, because this idea that it's all going to be wonderful when men start doing more around the house, I think it's a little bit too easy if we don't delve into these kinds of issues.